Thank you for providing those details. I'll create a compelling, realistic 4-chapter story about wrongful convictions in the United States during the late 1980s and early 1990s, following Jason, Lisa, and Ethan as they navigate the complexities of the justice system. Each chapter will be approximately 1,100 words, written in English, and maintain a realistic tone throughout. Wrongful convictions that changed lives forever. Chapter 1. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom buzzed overhead as Jason Mitchell stared blankly at the wooden table before him. His attorney's voice had become a distant hum, drowned out by the thundering of his own heartbeat as the jury foreman stood. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Jason Mitchell, guilty. Boston, 1989. A city gripped by rising crime rates and a public demanding justice at any cost. At 26, Jason had been building a modest contracting business, saving for a house with his fiancée, Melissa. Now, in an instant, everything was gone. Convicted of murdering a convenience store clerk during a robbery he hadn't committed, based on a partial fingerprint match and an eyewitness who was 99% certain it was him, despite being 50 feet away at night. There has to be a mistake, Jason whispered, his voice cracking. His attorney, a public defender with 93 active cases, merely shook his head. 3 months later, Jason sat in his cell at Massachusetts Correctional Institution at Cedar Junction, formerly known as Walpole State Prison. The concrete walls seemed to close in daily. The letters from friends had already started to dwindle. Only his mother visited regularly, her eyes filled with tears she tried desperately to hide. "I spoke to another lawyer," she said softly during one visit, sliding a business card across the table. "Her name is Lisa Brennan. She works with something called the Innocence Project. They're new, but they're helping people like you." Jason took the card, studying the simple black text. "Mom, I can't afford a private attorney." "She'll take your case pro bono if she believes in it," his mother insisted. "Please, Jason, write to her." Across town, Lisa Brennan sorted through case files in her cramped office. At 34, she'd abandoned a promising career at a prestigious law firm to focus on wrongful conviction cases. The pay was abysmal, the hours worse, but the work felt meaningful in a way corporate law never had. Her colleague David leaned against her doorframe. "Another appeal denied," he said, tossing a file onto her desk. "That's 3 this month." Lisa rubbed her temples. "The system's designed to uphold convictions, not question them, even when the evidence is flimsy at best." "Speaking of flimsy evidence," David continued, "you should look at this one." He handed her a letter. "Guy named Jason Mitchell. Convicted on partial prints and a questionable eyewitness ID. No other physical evidence." Lisa skimmed the letter. Her interest peaked. The clerk was killed during a robbery at 11:15 p.m. Mitchell was at a bar until 10:45, then stopped for gas at 11:30, receipt time-stamped. That's barely enough time to commit the crime, especially with the locations being miles apart. "Worth looking into?" David asked. Before Lisa could answer, her phone rang. "Lisa Brennan," she answered. "Ms. Brennan, this is Ethan Cooper from the Boston Herald. I'm working on a piece about wrongful convictions. Do you have time for an interview?" Ethan Cooper sat in his editor's office later that day, pitching his story idea. At 32, he'd built a reputation for hard-hitting investigative pieces, though lately he'd been assigned more sensationalist crime stories to boost declining readership. "Wrongful convictions," his editor scoffed. "People want to read about criminals getting what they deserve, not some bleeding heart nonsense about innocent men in prison." "But that's just it," Ethan argued. "What if they're not criminals? What if the system we trust to protect us is locking up innocent people? I've been tracking cases with overturned convictions. There's a pattern emerging, especially with eyewitness testimonies and outdated forensic techniques." His editor sighed. "Fine, you've got 2 weeks, but I want something compelling. Names, faces, real people the readers can connect with." Ethan nodded. already planning his approach. He'd start with Lisa Brennan, then dig into her cases, looking for patterns that might suggest systemic issues rather than isolated incidents. That evening, as Jason lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, a guard approached his cell. "Mitchell, you've got mail." He slid an envelope through the bars. Jason recognized the letterhead immediately. Lisa Brennan, attorney at law. With trembling fingers, he tore it open. "Dear Mr. Mitchell, I've reviewed your case and believe there are significant issues with the evidence presented at your trial. I would like to meet with you to discuss the possibility of filing an appeal based on new standards for forensic evidence and eyewitness testimony reliability." For the first time in months, Jason felt something stir within him, a dangerous emotion he'd been trying to suppress: hope. Meanwhile, across the city, Ethan sat in his apartment surrounded by newspaper clippings and notes. His wall had become a makeshift evidence board. Photos of convicted men later exonerated, statistics on eyewitness misidentifications, notes on forensic techniques now considered unreliable. His phone rang, breaking his concentration. "Cooper," he answered. "Mr. Cooper, this is Lisa Brennan. You wanted to talk about wrongful convictions? I think I have a case you might be interested in." As the night deepened, three individuals separated by circumstance, but connected by an invisible thread of injustice, prepared for battles that would define the next chapter of their lives. Jason clutched Lisa's letter, a talisman against despair. Lisa organized her notes for their meeting, determined to find the cracks in the prosecution's case. And Ethan jotted down questions for his interview, unaware that this story would become more than just another byline. Outside, Boston slept under a blanket of October rain, oblivious to the wheels of justice slowly beginning to turn toward truth. Chapter 2. 4 years, 3 months, and 17 days. Jason's voice was steady as he sat across from Lisa in the prison visiting room. "That's how long I've been here for a crime I didn't commit." Lisa studied him carefully. Prison had hardened him physically, his once soft features now angular, his eyes carrying a wariness that hadn't been present in the photos from before his conviction. Yet there was something in his demeanor that resonated with her, a quiet dignity that incarceration hadn't managed to strip away. "The fingerprint evidence they used," Lisa began, opening her folder. "It was only a partial match, 7 points of comparison, when most experts agree 12 to 16 points are needed for reliable identification. And the technology has improved significantly since your trial." Jason leaned forward. "Can we retest it?" "That's what I'm hoping," Lisa replied. "But first, I need to file a motion for preservation of evidence. There have been too many cases where evidence conveniently disappears once someone starts asking questions." And as they discussed the details of his case, neither noticed the man watching them from across the room, taking notes while pretending to visit another inmate. Ethan Cooper had managed to get himself on Jason's approved visitors list by claiming to be a distant cousin. The deception made him uncomfortable, but after 3 phone calls with Lisa Brennan, he was convinced this case deserved investigation. The problem was convincing his editor. "I don't care if you think he's innocent," his editor had barked that morning. "Readers don't want nuance. They want villains they can hate and heroes they can cheer for. Find me an angle that sells papers." Now, observing the interaction between the earnest attorney and her client, Ethan saw his angle. This wasn't just about a possibly innocent man. It was about a system designed to maintain convictions rather than seek truth, about underfunded public defenders and overworked courts, about the human cost of a justice system more concerned with efficiency than accuracy. Later that week, Lisa sat in her office reviewing Jason's case file for the 5th time when her colleague David knocked on her door. "You need to see this," he said, tossing a copy of the Boston Herald onto her desk. The headline read, "Justice Blinded, the Case of Jason Mitchell." Below it was a compelling photograph of Jason's mother standing outside the prison, clutching a picture of her son. Lisa quickly scanned the article. Ethan Cooper had done his homework, highlighting the questionable fingerprint evidence, the convenience store's poor lighting that made accurate identification nearly impossible, and Jason's alibi that had been dismissed despite the time-stamped gas receipt. "This could help," David remarked. "Public pressure sometimes makes judges more willing to reconsider evidence." Lisa nodded, though unease settled in her stomach. Or it could backfire. The DA's office doesn't like being made to look incompetent. They'll fight harder to maintain the conviction. At the district attorney's office, Assistant DA Thomas Pearson slammed the newspaper down on his desk. "Who the hell is this Lisa Brennan, and why is she dragging my case through the mud?" His colleague, Sarah Jensen, picked up the paper. "She's with that new Innocence group. Been making waves with a couple of successful appeals last year." "Well, she's picked the wrong case this time," Pearson growled. "Mitchell was guilty. The jury saw it, the judge saw it, and the appeals court saw it. This is just a publicity stunt." "What about the new DNA techniques?" Sarah asked cautiously. "They've been overturning convictions across the country." "There was no DNA evidence in this case," Pearson replied dismissively. "Just the fingerprint and the witness, both solid." Meanwhile, Ethan was building on his initial article, interviewing forensic experts about fingerprint reliability and psychologists about the factors affecting eyewitness accuracy. His editor, surprised by the positive response to the first piece, had grudgingly approved a follow-up. But as Ethan dug deeper, he discovered something troubling. A pattern of similar cases in the district, all prosecuted by the same Assistant DA, Thomas Pearson, all with minimal physical evidence, all relying heavily on eyewitness testimony, and all with defendants who couldn't afford private attorneys. When Ethan called Lisa to share his findings, she was cautious. "Correlation doesn't prove wrongdoing," she warned. "And making accusations against a prosecutor without solid evidence could undermine our case." "I'm not suggesting we publish anything yet," Ethan replied. "But don't you think it's worth looking into these other cases? What if there's a pattern of misconduct?" The question hung between them, fraught with implications. Lisa had been fighting an uphill battle for years, case by case. The possibility of exposing systemic issues was tempting, but the risks were enormous, not just to her career, but to the cases of men like Jason, whose freedom hung in the balance. In his cell, Jason read Ethan's article for the 20th time, the paper now worn at the creases. Around him, other inmates had begun to look at him differently, some with newfound respect, others with suspicion. The article had made him a target, but it had also given him something to cling to. That night, as a summer thunderstorm raged outside, 3 souls wrestled with their own storms. Jason paced his cell, 7 steps each way, fighting to maintain hope in a place designed to crush it. Lisa sat surrounded by case files, searching for the thread that might unravel the tapestry of injustice. And Ethan stared at his computer screen, the cursor blinking on a half-finished sentence, weighing the responsibility of the story unfolding before him. None of them slept well that night, each haunted by the question that had brought them together. How many lives had been destroyed in the name of justice? Chapter 3. Autumn 1991. 2 years had passed since Lisa took on Jason's case, and progress moved at an excruciating pace. Each motion was met with opposition, each request for evidence review delayed by procedural hurdles. The justice system, designed to be deliberate, felt deliberately obstructive. Lisa stood before Judge Eleanor Harrington, making her case for a review of the fingerprint evidence using newer technology. "Your Honor, in light of recent advances in fingerprint analysis and the establishment of more rigorous standards, we request that the partial print found at the crime scene be re-examined." Assistant DA Pearson rose immediately. "Your Honor, this is merely a fishing expedition. The defendant has exhausted his appeals, and this so-called new technology is simply a repackaging of existing methods." Judge Harrington, known for her methodical approach, studied both attorneys. "Ms. Brennan, are you suggesting that the expert testimony presented at trial was flawed?" Not flawed by the standards of the time, Your Honor, Lisa clarified, but our understanding of forensic science has evolved. What was considered conclusive then might not meet today's standards of reliability. The courtroom remained tense as the judge considered. Finally, she spoke. I'll allow the re-examination of the fingerprint evidence, but only by an independent expert approved by both the defense and prosecution. Outside the courthouse, Ethan waited, having become a fixture at Jason's hearings. Over the past 2 years, his initial article had expanded into a series examining wrongful convictions nationwide, earning him both acclaim and criticism. We got the review, Lisa told him, tempering excitement with caution, but finding an expert both sides can agree on will be challenging. And even if the fingerprint analysis is questioned, we still have the eyewitness testimony to overcome. Ethan nodded, jotting notes. I've been researching similar cases. The Supreme Court recently acknowledged that eyewitness testimony can be uniquely unreliable. Maybe we can leverage that. Their conversation was interrupted by the appearance of Thomas Pearson, exiting the courthouse. He paused, eyeing them with undisguised contempt. Enjoying your little crusade? He asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Just pursuing justice, Mr. Pearson, Lisa replied evenly. Same as you. His laugh was cold. Justice was served when Mitchell was convicted. What you're doing is reopening wounds for the victim's family and undermining public confidence in our courts. He stepped closer to Ethan. And you're exploiting tragedy for newspaper sales. As Pearson walked away, Ethan turned to Lisa. He seems personally invested in maintaining this conviction. Most prosecutors are, Lisa sighed. Their careers are built on conviction rates. Admitting a mistake isn't just about one case. It calls their entire record into question. Lou. Within the prison walls, Jason had found an unexpected ally in his cellmate, Marcus, a former paralegal serving time for fraud. Marcus had been helping Jason understand the legal processes, explaining motions and precedents in terms he could grasp. This fingerprint review is huge, Marcus explained as they sat in the prison library. If they find it doesn't meet current standards, you could get a new trial. Jason's response was measured. I've learned not to hope too much. Every time I think we're making progress, something pulls us back. Marcus studied him. You're different from most guys in here, still got your dignity. Some days barely, Jason admitted. Yesterday was Melissa's wedding day. His former fiancée had waited 3 years before moving on with her life. He couldn't blame her, but the finality of it had hit him hard. Later that week, Lisa visited again, bringing news that the prosecution had finally agreed to an expert, Dr. Renee Howard from the University of Michigan, a respected figure in forensic science with no ties to either side. How long will the analysis take? Jason asked. A few weeks for the actual work, Lisa explained, but the court processes could stretch it out to months. Jason nodded, resigned to the pace. I've been thinking about something. Even if we prove the fingerprint evidence is flawed, what about the witness? Mrs. Chen was convinced it was me. Lisa hesitated before sharing her strategy. Ethan found something interesting. 3 other cases in this district with eyewitness identifications that were later proven wrong. All 3 witnesses described being shown photos in a way that subtly guided them toward identifying the police's primary suspect. You think that happened with Mrs. Chen? I don't know, Lisa admitted, but I've filed a motion to review the photo array procedures used in your case. If they deviated from best practices, it could further weaken the prosecution's case. Meanwhile, Ethan had begun investigating Thomas Pearson more deeply, reviewing every case the prosecutor had handled in the past decade. A pattern emerged: aggressive prosecution, reliance on minimal evidence, and a remarkable tendency to secure plea deals from defendants represented by overworked public defenders. But one case particularly caught his attention, a robbery conviction from 1987 where the defendant had steadfastly maintained his innocence despite being offered a reduced sentence. The physical description of the perpetrator was strikingly similar to another man arrested for a similar crime 6 months later, but this lead had never been pursued. Ethan brought his findings to Lisa one evening as they worked late in her office. "I think Pearson has been cutting corners for years," he explained, spreading his notes across her desk. "Not necessarily planting evidence or anything that dramatic, but pushing cases forward on shaky grounds, especially when the defendants don't have resources to fight back." Lisa studied the materials, her expression troubled. "This could be significant, but it's also dangerous territory. If we accuse a prosecutor of misconduct without ironclad proof, it could backfire spectacularly." "But if we're right," Ethan pressed, "it's not just about Jason anymore. It's about potentially dozens of wrongful convictions." The weight of the decision settled between them as the office grew quiet. Outside, Boston's lights twinkled in the early evening darkness, a city continuing its life while men like Jason remained frozen in time, waiting for justice that came too slowly, if at all. Chapter 4. Winter 1993. Snow fell gently outside the courthouse as Lisa Brennan made her final arguments before Judge Harrington. 4 years had passed since she took Jason's case, years marked by small victories and crushing setbacks, by mounting evidence and bureaucratic resistance. "Your Honor," Lisa began, her voice steady despite her exhaustion, "the evidence before you demonstrates not just reasonable doubt, but clear indicators of innocence. Dr. Howard's analysis conclusively shows that the fingerprint evidence fails to meet current scientific standards. The original analysis identified only 7 points of comparison, while current standards require 12 to 16 for a reliable match." She gestured to the exhibits displayed on the court monitor. "Furthermore, our expert in eyewitness psychology has testified that the photo array procedures used with Mrs. Chen were fundamentally flawed. She was shown the photos sequentially rather than simultaneously, with the detective providing subtle feedback that reinforced her selection of Mr. Mitchell's photograph. Thomas Pearson rose for rebuttal, but the confidence that had characterized his earlier appearances had diminished. The past year had been difficult for the prosecutor, as Ethan Cooper's investigation had expanded to include other questionable convictions from his office. "Your Honor, while the defense has raised technical objections to the evidence, the fact remains that a jury found Mr. Mitchell guilty beyond reasonable doubt. The integrity of our justice system depends on respecting the finality of such verdicts." Judge Harrington, who had presided over the case for years now, looked between the attorneys. "I have reviewed all evidence and arguments carefully. This court will issue its ruling on Monday morning." The weekend that followed was the longest of Jason's life. Now 34, he had spent 8 years behind bars, watching through barred windows as the world continued without him. His mother, now using a walker and accompanied by his sister, had attended every hearing, her faith unwavering despite the toll the years had taken. On Monday morning, the courtroom was packed. Ethan sat in the front row beside Jason's family, his notepad ready. The Boston Herald had devoted significant coverage to the case, and other media had followed suit, turning Jason Mitchell into a symbol of potential injustice within the system. Judge Harrington entered, and the room fell silent. "In the matter of Mitchell versus the Commonwealth, this court has carefully considered all evidence and arguments presented by both sides. Based on the significant questions raised about both the fingerprint evidence and the eyewitness identification procedures, I am setting aside Mr. Mitchell's conviction and ordering a new trial." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Lisa gripped the table, steadying herself. Beside her, Jason remained perfectly still, as if fearing any movement might shatter this moment. Judge Harrington continued, "Furthermore, given the substantial doubts about the evidence, I am ordering Mr. Mitchell's immediate release pending retrial, subject to appropriate conditions." The courtroom erupted. Jason turned to Lisa, his eyes filled with tears. "Is this real?" he whispered. "It's real," she assured him, her own voice breaking. "You're going home." That afternoon, Jason Mitchell walked out of the courthouse, a free man for the first time in 8 years. The winter sunlight seemed impossibly bright, the air sweeter than he remembered. His mother wept openly as she embraced him, surrounded by supporters carrying signs reading "Justice Delayed" and "Freedom for the Innocent." Ethan stood nearby, watching the reunion with a journalist's practiced detachment, though his own eyes glistened. His series on Jason's case had expanded into a book examining wrongful convictions nationwide, shining a light on systemic failures from faulty forensics to prosecutorial overreach. 2 weeks later, the district attorney's office announced they would not pursue a retrial, citing insufficient evidence to meet the burden of proof. It wasn't an admission of error, but it was as close as the system would come to acknowledging the injustice Jason had endured. The aftermath brought both healing and new wounds. Jason struggled to rebuild his life in a world that had continued without him. Technology had advanced, old friends had moved away, and his contracting skills had atrophied during his years of confinement. Simple tasks like using an ATM or navigating the internet became overwhelming challenges. Lisa helped him file for compensation under Massachusetts' wrongful conviction statute, though the maximum payment, $500,000, seemed woefully inadequate for 8 stolen years. The civil rights lawsuit against the police department for improper identification procedures would take years to resolve. Thomas Pearson resigned from the district attorney's office amid mounting scrutiny of his past cases. 3 other convictions he had secured were under review, with preliminary evidence suggesting similar patterns of questionable evidence and procedural shortcuts. Ethan's book became a bestseller, bringing national attention to the issue of wrongful convictions. He established a foundation to support exonerees' reintegration into society, using a portion of the proceeds to fund programs providing housing, employment assistance, and counseling. 1 year after his release, Jason sat with Lisa and Ethan at a small cafe near the harbor. The spring air carried promises of renewal, though all 3 bore the marks of their journey: Jason's premature gray, Lisa's deepened worry lines, Ethan's more somber perspective. The state legislature is considering a bill to reform eyewitness identification procedures, Lisa mentioned, stirring her coffee. They're calling it the Mitchell Standards. Jason smiled faintly. At least something good might come from all this. "How's the new apartment?" Ethan asked. "Getting used to it," Jason replied. "Still wake up sometimes thinking I'm in my cell. Doctor says that might not ever completely go away." They sat in companionable silence, each reflecting on how their lives had become intertwined by injustice and the pursuit of its remedy. "I met with Mrs. Chen last week," Jason said suddenly. Both Lisa and Ethan looked up in surprise. The convenience store clerk's widow had remained convinced of Jason's guilt despite the overturned conviction. "I wanted her to know I don't blame her. She was doing what she thought was right, identifying the man she believed killed her husband." "That's remarkably gracious," Lisa said softly. Jason shrugged. "Holding on to anger doesn't help anyone, and she's a victim in this too. First losing her husband, then being led to identify the wrong person, and now knowing the real killer might never be caught." His words hung in the air, a testament to the complex aftermath of injustice. There were no neat resolutions, no moment when everything was made right. The damage had rippled outward, touching countless lives. The Mitchell family, Mrs. Chen, the investigators who'd gotten it wrong, even Pearson, whose career had imploded. As they parted ways that afternoon, each carried a piece of their shared history. Lisa returned to her office, where 3 new cases awaited her attention. Other Jasons, fighting against the weight of wrongful convictions. Ethan headed to a university lecture where he would speak to law students about the media's role in examining justice system failures. And Jason walked slowly along the harbor, reacquainting himself with freedom, with Boston, with a life interrupted but not ended. The story of Jason Mitchell's wrongful conviction had changed them all, revealing both the profound flaws in a system designed by imperfect humans and the remarkable resilience of those who refuse to accept injustice as the final word. In the system where truth sometimes came too late, they had learned that justice, while imperfect, was still worth fighting for. One case, one life, one wrong at a time.